I thought college would be overwhelming when I first started. Coming from a small town, the campus with over 50,000 students felt like a different planet. The constant buzz of activity, the crowds, and the events were a stark contrast to the quiet streets I was used to, but none of that prepared me for the eerie emptiness during Thanksgiving break. I couldn't afford to go home, so I stayed back in my dorm. What had been a bustling hub of energy transformed into a ghost town. The dorm halls were silent, the campus paths deserted. I felt like I was the only person left in the entire university. It was unsettling, to say the least. Then the snowstorm hit the night before Thanksgiving. I woke up to an eerie scene, snow blanketing the empty campus, the wind howling outside, and not a single soul in sight. The once busy pathways were now untouched stretches of white, and the world seemed completely still. By Thanksgiving Day, cabin fever began to creep in. My dinner plans involved a microwave turkey dinner, but the idea of being cooped up all day didn't sit right. So I decided to venture out to the Denny's on campus. Dinner started off fine, but I soon noticed a man seated across the restaurant staring at me. He was older, maybe in his late 30s, with disheveled hair and an unsettling intensity in his eyes. His gaze never wavered, making me feel like I was under a spotlight. I scarfed down my food and left quickly, feeling too uncomfortable to linger. The walk back to my dorm was tense. Every sound, the crunch of snow under my boots, the rustling of wind, felt amplified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and sure enough, the man was following me. He quickened his pace, and panic set in as I fumbled to unlock the dorm's front door. He called out, asking me to hold the door for him, but I ignored him and rushed inside. Safely in my room, I tried to shake off the fear. But later that night, a knock at my door made my heart stop. I checked the peephole and froze. It was him. Somehow he had gotten inside the building. He knocked again, but I didn't respond. I stayed completely silent until he finally left. Hours later, there was another knock, but this time it was campus security. They were investigating an assault on another student in the dorm. When they asked if I had seen anything suspicious, I told them about the man who had followed me. They brought me to identify their suspect, and sure enough, it was him. He had gone door to door until someone opened their door, and that poor student suffered the consequences. Thanksgiving in the city is a big deal. Every year there's a massive parade that draws people from all over. I'd never been to one in person, but I always watched it on TV. That year I decided to go, even though none of my friends or family wanted to join me. It felt like a tradition worth experiencing firsthand, even if I had to do it alone. By the time I arrived, the parade route was already packed. The streets were alive with chatter, laughter, and the sound of the marching bands warming up. Balloons shaped like beloved characters floated high above the buildings, and the floats were vibrant and dazzling, even from a distance. I managed to squeeze into a spot behind a group of people that gave me a good view despite my shorter stature. The air was crisp, and the smell of roasted chestnuts and pretzels from nearby vendors filled the air. The energy was contagious, and for a moment, I forgot I was alone. I found myself smiling at the floats, enjoying the performances, and cheering along with the crowd. But then something shifted. I noticed a man in the crowd who gave me an uneasy feeling. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and a bit unkempt, wearing a heavy coat that looked a little too big for him. His clothes were wrinkled, and his face was shadowed by the brim of his hat. It wasn't his appearance alone that unsettled me. It was something about the way he stood there, rigid and tense, his eyes darting around before locking onto me. I tried to shake it off, but my attention kept drifting back to him. He wasn't watching the parade like everyone else. He seemed more interested in the people around him. Every time I glanced in his direction, he caught me looking, his eyes narrowing slightly each time. Embarrassed, I quickly looked away, but curiosity kept getting the better of me. There was something about him I couldn't ignore, even though every instinct told me I should. The third or fourth time our eyes met, his expression changed. He looked annoyed, maybe even angry. I turned my attention firmly back to the parade. determined not to look again. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. At first, I thought it was just the natural flow of the crowd, but as I watched, it became clear he was heading straight for me. My heart started to race. I decided to test my suspicion. I shifted toward the back of the sidewalk, pretending to adjust my scarf. When I glanced over, my worst fear was confirmed. He was following me. He weaved through the crowd casually, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. My pulse quickened as I realized this wasn't a coincidence. I tried to reassure myself. We were in a massive crowd surrounded by thousands of people. Surely nothing could happen here. But as he closed the distance, that small comfort started to fade. The man was deliberate, his movements calculated. When he finally reached me, standing just a few inches away, I felt something sharp press against my back. "Why were you staring at me?" he hissed. His voice was low and filled with venom, and the blade's pressure increased slightly. "You working for him? What did McAllister tell you?" My mind raced, struggling to process his words. I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the noise of the parade. "I wasn't staring, I swear." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, pushing the knife harder. "How much is he paying you?" "I don't know who McAllister is," I pleaded, tears welling up in my eyes. "You've got the wrong person." He didn't believe me. His eyes darted around, scanning the crowd as he whispered harshly, "Tell me the truth or you'll regret it." I was paralyzed with fear, unable to think of anything that might convince him to let me go. My voice cracked as I begged him to leave me alone, repeating over and over that I didn't know anything. My knees felt weak, and I was sure he would snap at any moment. Thankfully, two men nearby noticed the tension. One of them called out, "Hey, what's going on here?" while the other stepped closer, his brows furrowed in concern. The man with the knife stiffened, his grip on the weapon faltering. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but instead he slipped the knife away, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the crowd. The two men stayed with me for a few moments, asking if I was okay. I nodded, too shaken to say much, and they walked me to the edge of the parade route, ensuring I had a clear path to leave. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he thought I knew. I don't know who McAllister is or why he believed I was involved. But one thing is certain, I've learned to trust my instincts and to be more cautious in a crowd. That day could have ended very differently, and I'll never forget how close I came to finding out just how far he was willing to go. My cousins had come to my house for Thanksgiving that year. It was supposed to be a joyful holiday filled with good food, laughter, and cherished moments with family. Max, my 2-pound Yorkie, was at the center of all the attention. He was always the life of the party, small in size but big in personality. The kids adored him and he loved the extra playtime. His little tail wagged excitedly whenever someone called his name, and he darted around like he was invincible. That day, the kids were playing with Max in the other room. I wasn't paying close attention. With so much happening, setting the table, catching up with relatives, and just trying to keep the Thanksgiving chaos under control, I figured everything was fine. I could hear their laughter and the occasional bark from Max. It was comforting, a background soundtrack to a family holiday. At some point, though, things went quiet. I didn't notice at first, too caught up in conversation with the adults. But then, one of my younger cousins appeared in the doorway. She was holding Max in her arms and her face was pale, her lips trembling. I froze, a sense of dread creeping in. "What's wrong?" I asked, standing up. She didn't answer right away. She just held Max out to me. That's when I realized he wasn't moving. His tiny body hung limp, his usual energy gone. My chest tightened as I took him from her, my mind racing with denial. "Number, this can't be real. He's fine. He has to be fine." Through broken sobs, she explained what had happened. They had been playing on the bunk bed, tossing a toy for Max. In their excitement, they didn't think about how dangerous it was. Max had been so quick darting after the toy, and before they could stop him, he had slipped and fallen off the edge. For a dog as tiny as Max, the fall was catastrophic. His neck had snapped instantly. I stood there, holding him in my arms, completely numb. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rewind time and stop it from happening. The kids were crying too, apologizing over and over. "I'm so sorry," my cousin kept saying, her voice barely audible through her tears. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. I wasn't angry at her. I knew it was an accident, that they hadn't meant for this to happen. Still, the overwhelming guilt I felt crushed me. I should have been there. I should have been paying attention. The atmosphere in the house shifted immediately. What had been a warm, lively celebration turned cold and somber. The laughter and chatter were replaced by silence. My cousins retreated to their parents, clinging to them, still sobbing. My own parents tried to comfort me, but their words felt hollow. There was nothing anyone could say to fix what had happened. That night, I sat alone in my room with Max's empty bed and his favorite toy, a little stuffed bear he loved to chew on. The house was quiet except for the occasional muffled sounds of my cousins crying in the other room. I stared at his bed, my heart aching with every memory of him. The way he used to curl up in my lap while I worked, his excited yips whenever I came home, the way he would nuzzle his tiny head under my hand for attention. All of it was gone in an instant, and I couldn't stop blaming myself. Even 2 years later, the pain hasn't fully faded. Thanksgiving has never felt the same since. Every year, the memory of that day resurfaces, the joy of having Max around, and the gut-wrenching moment he was taken away. I know it wasn't my fault entirely, but the guilt lingers. I let him down. I should have kept him safe. We miss you, little dude. You brought so much happiness into our lives, and the house feels emptier without you. I hope you know how much you are loved and how deeply you are missed. Rest easy, Max. You'll always be in my heart.